The fact that I'm doing my progressive essay project on gender and sexism and haven't mentioned the second sex probably seems pretty odd. But that's because I'm less interested in sexism as an isolated concept, and more interested in how it functions and manifests in texts of all kind, especially those that aren't explicitly about gender or sexism. Lined up side by side, my essays from this term, and even one from last term, build upon each other pretty nicely, and form a very comprehensive look at the different ways that sexism can manifest as well as be expressed. This all started last semester when I wrote an essay about the way in which Frankenstein develops a sexist attitude. I talked about the monster's limited social exposure, and discussed the way in which he retold the story of him observing the cottage dwellers, and how they demonstrated that he gleaned pretty sexist ideals from watching the young women in the cottage. Once I had identified the monster as a sexist creature, I moved on in my next essay to discuss the fact that his violence wasn't being attributed to his sexist attitudes, although that was probably the cause. Instead, the monster was written off as purely evil, with no explanation for his violent actions. Afterward, I talked about how this is reflected in our time. There are a lot of violent actions that have sexist implications or a base of sexism that really are just described as purely evil and left at that. And I talked about the harm of that, how dismissing sexism as a cause for violence will just lead to more violence because it's not addressed. After that, I realized that it was probably time to move on from Frankenstein, so I took a look at the two films, Battle of Algiers and All About My Mother. Both the Algerian women of Battle of Algiers and a grotto from All About My Mother were held under sexist expectations. In the essay, I procedurally broke down the way in which a grotto and the women of Battle of Algiers used these sexist expectations to their advantage, exploiting them to find some benefit for themselves. The thing that I really liked about this essay was that it kind of humanized the idea of sexism. It showed that sexism doesn't exist in a vacuum. It affects people, and people affect it. In this case, people found their way to work around it. The last essay cements the gravity of sexism, and the fact that it tends to creep itself into stories where it might not be expected. I synthesized the discussion of three very different texts, Genesis, Gandhi, and Hamlet, and showed that together they demonstrate a really intricate portrait of the proper role for women. I also use these texts to talk about how sexism isn't always direct and explicit. Sometimes it's very subtle, maybe not even conscious. With all of these essays, I think I did a very nice job kind of taking the abstraction out of sexism. While the second sex has a lot of details, it's sort of hard to see how it functions and manifests in actual communication and interaction between individuals. Looking forward, I'm excited to keep continuing my exploration of how sexism works, not necessarily sexism as an isolated concept, but how it functions in stories and texts of all kind.